The afternoon sun did not stream into the dining room. It intruded. It slashed across the mahogany table in thick, dust-filled beams that highlighted every scratch in the varnish, every smudge on the silver, and every deepening line on my face. It was my 80th birthday. There was a cake somewhere, I suppose, likely sitting in a cardboard box in the kitchen, sweating under sugary icing. But here, in the formal dining room, the air was not festive. It was stagnant. It tasted of lemon floor polish, stale lavender, and the copper tang of imminent betrayal. The silence was heavy, a suffocating blanket that pressed against my chest, making each breath a conscious, deliberate labor. I sat at the head of the table, a position I had held for 40 years, though today I felt less like a matriarch and more like a museum exhibit, a relic to be dusted off, inspected for damage, and ultimately discarded. My hands rested on the table, clutching a teacup of bone china so delicate it felt as if it might shatter under the weight of my own pulse. The tea inside had gone cold hours ago, a murky pool reflecting the indifference of the room. I made my hand tremble. It was a subtle performance, a slight rhythmic shaking of the wrists that caused the china to rattle softly against the saucer. Clink, clink, clink. A pitiful sound, the sound of weakness. David, my son, my only child, was pacing the length of the Persian rug. The sound of his Italian leather loafers on the parquet floor was a rhythmic assault. Clip-clop, pacing back and forth like a caged predator, sensing the lock was about to break. He wasn't looking at me. He hadn't looked at me since he arrived. He looked through me, his gaze fixed on the crown molding, the drapes, the assets. He held a crystal balloon glass in his hand, swirling the amber liquid violently. The smell hit me from across the table, rich, oaky, with notes of dried fruit and vanilla, my husband's vintage cognac, the 1948 Remy Martin. It had been sealed for decades, waiting for a wedding, a birth, a monumental joy. David had popped the cork without asking, the violation casual and absolute. He didn't even appreciate it. He drank it like water, using the alcohol to fuel his own arrogance. "Look at her, Elena," David barked, his voice bouncing off the high ceilings. It was a sharp, dismissive sound, devoid of affection. He gestured toward me with the hand holding the glass, risking a spill of the precious liquid onto the carpet. She's staring at the wallpaper again. She's fascinated by the damask. God, it's depressing. She's completely gone. Elena, his wife, sat to my right. She was scrolling through her phone, her thumb flicking upward with hypnotic regularity. She wore a dress that was too tight and perfume that was too sweet, a cloying floral scent that warred with the aroma of the cognac. "It happens, Dave," she murmured, not looking up. 80 is old. The mind just unravels. David stopped pacing. He walked over to me, towering over my chair. He leaned down, his face uncomfortably close. I could smell the alcohol on his breath, mixed with the mint of a breath strip. He waved a hand in front of my face, fingers splayed, cutting through the stagnant air. "Hello, Earth to Martha," he mocked. I forced my eyes to remain wide, vacant. I blinked slowly, deliberately, like a shutter closing on a broken lens. I let my jaw go slightly slack. Inside, behind the cataracts of my act, my mind was a steel trap, coiled and waiting. Let him think the silence is emptiness, I told myself. Let him think the trembling is fear. He sees a withered husk. He doesn't see the wolf waiting in the shadows of the trap. He straightened up, satisfied with my lack of response. He turned back to Elena, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial volume that was still perfectly audible to me. "I've already spoken to the broker, Elena. It's done. Once we get the power of attorney signed tomorrow, and she will sign it, she doesn't know what day of the week it is, we can move forward. The first thing to go is that monstrosity of a garden." My heart hammered against my ribs, a trapped bird. The garden, my hydrangeas, the soil I had turned with my own hands when David was just a boy. "Prime real estate," David continued, gesturing toward the French doors that led to the terrace. "Wasted on hydrangeas. We bulldoze it, subdivide the lot. We can fit 3 townhouses on that back acre alone. The ink won't even be dry on the deed before the excavators roll in." Bulldoze. The word hung in the air, violent and final. He spoke of destroying my sanctuary as casually as one discusses taking out the trash. He saw land. He didn't see the history buried beneath the roots. He didn't know what was hidden under the gazebo. David walked back to the head of the table. He finished the cognac in one large gulp and set the glass down hard on the polished wood, leaving a ring of condensation. He leaned in again, his voice loud, condescending, the way one speaks to a disobedient child or a stubborn pet. "Mom," he shouted, enunciating every syllable. "Listen to me. We've made arrangements. We're going to move you to Sunny Meadows tomorrow. It's a nice place. Assisted living, nurses, Jell-O. It's better for you." Sunny Meadows, a warehouse for the dying, a place where they sedate the inconvenient elderly until they quietly expire. I said nothing. I kept my eyes fixed on the wallpaper pattern, tracing the intertwining vines with my gaze. Slowly, with agonizing precision, I lifted my teacup one last time and then set it down. Clatter. The sound echoed in the silence. David smirked, glancing at Elena. He took my silence for submission. He thought he had won. He thought the game was over. But he had forgotten one thing: to check whose name was actually on the deed in the safe upstairs. And more importantly, he had forgotten that I was the one who taught him how to lie. Does he really think I'm gonna let him sign my life away without a fight? The grandfather clock in the downstairs hallway struck 12. The sound was a deep, resonant bronze that vibrated through the floorboards, counting down the death of another day. I waited for the 12th chime to fade into the heavy silence of the house before I allowed myself to move. Instantly, the performance ended. The tremble in my hands, a carefully cultivated palsy I had maintained since breakfast, vanished. My spine, which had been curved into a fragile question mark for the benefit of an audience of 2, snapped straight with a satisfying pop. I took a deep breath, inhaling the cool, recycled air of the house, and exhaled the persona of the senile octogenarian. The confused old woman who stared at wallpaper was gone. The matriarch had returned. I rose from the wing-back chair in my bedroom, not with the groans of the elderly, but with the silent efficiency of a woman who had learned to walk without making a sound. I slipped my feet into soft-soled velvet slippers. I did not need a cane. I did not need a nightlight. I knew every creak in these floorboards, every drafty corner, every shadow. I had navigated this house in the dark for 50 years. I opened my bedroom door and stepped into the corridor. Down the hall, a rhythmic, guttural snoring emanated from the guest suite. David, sleeping off the vintage cognac he had stolen. He was likely dreaming of bulldozers and bank balances, confident that the vegetable in the master bedroom was fast asleep, her mind a blank slate. He was a fool. He forgot that wolves are nocturnal. I moved past his door, a ghost in my own home, and descended the main staircase. My destination was not the kitchen for a glass of warm milk, but the heavy oak doors at the end of the east wing, the library. I pushed the doors open. They swung inward on hinges I kept personally oiled, silent as a held breath. The air inside was different here. It was cooler, denser. It smelled of centuries of cured leather, dust, and the lingering, sweet scent of vanilla pipe tobacco. My husband Arthur had been dead for 15 years, yet the ghost of his tobacco clung to the velvet drapes, a comforting olfactory memory. This was my sanctuary, my war room. I didn't go to the wall safe behind the portrait of the huntmaster. That was the first place David would look. He probably already had the combination, 1948, the year of the cognac. No. I walked past the safe, past the desk, to the towering shelves of Victorian classics on the north wall. My fingers trailed over the spines, Dickens, Austen, Hardy, until they rested on a dark, cracked leather binding. King Lear, a tragedy about a parent who trusted the wrong children and banished the one who truly loved him. The irony was a private joke I savored. I pulled the book down. It was heavy, the paper thick and rough against my fingertips. I opened it to Act 3, Scene 2. Between pages 100 and 101, where the storm rages on the heath, lay a thick manila envelope. I carried it to the Assis Aurora desk and switched on the green banker's lamp, keeping the light low. I slid the contents out. The sound of the paper sliding against the wood was crisp, sharp. The sound of a guillotine blade being sharpened. This was not merely a will. A will is a wish. This was a weapon. I spread the documents out. My forensic accountant had been thorough. It wasn't just a new last will and testament disinheriting David. It was a dossier. I ran a manicured fingernail down the columns of figures. January 12th, $15,000 withdrawal. Purpose, roof repairs. There were no repairs. March 4th, $22,000 transfer. Recipient, Consulting Services, LLC, a shell company registered to Elena's brother. July 10th, $50,000 liquidation of bonds. Purpose, medical expenses for Martha. I paused at that one. Medical expenses. He had billed my estate for the very nurses he claimed I needed while pocketing the cash and leaving me with nothing but a daily visit from a cheap agency aide. I had watched him do it. I had sat in this very chair, feigning a nap, listening to him on the phone, authorizing the transfers, thinking I was too far gone to understand the words wire transfer and Cayman. He thought my silence was dementia. He never realized it was evidence gathering. I stacked the papers neatly, the bank statements, the routing numbers, the notarized affidavit from his former secretary proving the embezzlement. It was all there, enough to not only cut him out of the fortune, but to put him in a cell for a very long time. I reached into the bottom drawer of the desk, feeling for the false back. My fingers brushed against the cool plastic of a burner phone, a cheap prepaid device David didn't know existed. I powered it on. The screen glowed blue in the dim library, a modern anomaly among the antiques. I dialed a number I had memorized. It rang once. Henderson. A gruff voice answered instantly. He was expecting the call. "It's time," I said. My voice was low, steady, devoid of the tremor I used in the daylight. "He's making his move tomorrow at 9 a.m. He's bringing the power of attorney forms." "I have the paperwork ready, Martha," Henderson replied. "Do you want the police involved immediately?" "Not yet," I said, looking down at the ledger of David's betrayals. "I want him to feel safe first. I want him to think he's won. Bring the file, and bring the security team. I want him to remember this morning for the rest of his life." "Understood. We'll be at the gates at 8:55. "Good." I hung up and slid the phone back into its hiding place. I placed the dossier back inside King Lear, smoothing the leather cover. I stood up, extinguishing the lamp, plunging the room back into darkness. As I turned to leave, A floorboard creaked in the hallway just outside the library doors. I froze. The house held its breath. Was it the settling of the old wood, or had the wolf woken up? 9 o'clock arrived with the punctuality of an executioner. The morning light was harder today, brittle and unforgiving, washing out the warmth of the wood paneling and leaving the dining room exposed and cold. I sat in my usual chair, my hands folded in my lap, playing the part of the obedient, withered child. David sat at the head of the table. He had usurped my seat, a physical manifestation of his assumed victory. Spread out before him was a chaotic fan of paperwork, legal documents with colorful sign here, sticky tabs fluttering like little flags of conquest. To his right, a carafe of coffee steamed, the rich aroma unable to mask the sour scent of his impatience. He checked his Rolex, a gift I had bought him for his 40th birthday, purchased with the dividends of stocks he was now trying to steal, and tapped the crystal face. Tick, tick, tick. He was in a rush to erase me. Near my plate, conspicuously placed like a threat, was the brochure. It was glossy, tri-folded, and printed in a nauseating shade of pastel pink. Sunny meadows, dignity in twilight. The cover featured a stock photo of an elderly woman smiling vacantly at a generic garden, a blanket tucked over her knees. It promised round-the-clock care and secure perimeters. It was a prison pamphlet disguised as a vacation brochure. "Okay, Mom," David said, his voice tight. He didn't look up from the documents. He was organizing the stack, prioritizing the power of attorney. "We're on a schedule. The car for the facility will be here in an hour. We need to get this administrative stuff out of the way first." He slid a single sheet of paper across the polished mahogany. It stopped inches from my hands. Then he slid a pen toward me. It wasn't his fountain pen. It was a cheap plastic ballpoint he must have picked up from a bank counter. He didn't deem me worthy of a proper writing instrument anymore. "Just sign here, Mom," he said, pointing to a line marked with a yellow arrow. "It's just for your medical care, so the doctors can help you." I looked at the pen, a cheap, disposable thing, a tool for a disposable woman. I reached out. My hand trembled. The final encore of my performance. I picked up the pen. I felt the cheap plastic against my skin. I brought it toward the paper, hovering the tip over the signature line. David let out a breath he had been holding, his shoulders sagging in relief. He thought the lock had clicked. He thought the deed was done. I stopped. Slowly, I lifted my head. I locked my eyes onto his. For the last 6 months, David had looked at me and seen a fog. He'd seen cataracts and confusion. But now, as our gazes met across the table, I let the fog evaporate. I scrubbed the vacancy from my expression. I straightened my spine, pulling my shoulders back until I sat regally, imposingly upright. The tremor in my hand vanished instantly, replaced by a grip of iron. David blinked. He froze, his smile faltering, uncertain of what he was seeing. It was as if a statue had suddenly opened its eyes. "Mom," he whispered, the word trembling more than I ever had. I held his gaze, cold and unblinking. "I don't think so, David." My voice was not the whisper of an old woman. It was the clear, commanding contralto that had run this estate for 4 decades. With a sharp, deliberate movement, I snapped the plastic pen in half. Crack. Ink splattered onto the pristine white of his fraudulent contract, a black Rorschach test of his failure. I dropped the broken pieces onto the document. Before he could process the shift, the double doors of the dining room burst open. They didn't just open, they were thrown wide with the force of a raid. Mr. Henderson, our family attorney for 30 years, strode into the room. He was not alone. Flanking him were two men in dark suits, their builds heavy and blocking out the light from the hallway. Private security, armed and stone-faced. Henderson carried no medical forms. In his hand, held like a divine tablet, was the leather-bound folder I had retrieved from King Lear the night before. David scrambled up from his chair, knocking it backward. It clattered loudly against the floor. "What is this? Who are you?" He looked wildly from Henderson to the guards, and finally back to me. His face was flushing a deep, ugly red. "She's incompetent. You can't be here. She doesn't know what she's doing." I stood up. I didn't use the table for support. I rose smoothly, towering over the ruins of his breakfast. "I am not senile, David," I said, my voice cutting through his panic like a scalpel. "I was just patient." I picked up the file Henderson had placed on the table and threw it. It slid across the mahogany with a heavy hiss, shh, thwack, and hit David square in the chest. He fumbled, catching it instinctively against his silk tie. "Read page 4, I commanded, the section detailing the unauthorized withdrawals from the trust, and the amendment regarding the revised estate beneficiary. It seems the hydrangeas will be inheriting everything, David. You get nothing." David opened the folder. His eyes darted across the pages, the bank statements, the forensic accounting, the dates, the times. The color drained from his face, leaving him a sickly, waxen gray. He looked up, terror replacing the arrogance. He realized finally that the senile act hadn't been a symptom. It had been a surveillance operation. "Mom," he stammered, his voice cracking. I was just trying to manage things. I can explain. It's a misunderstanding." I raised a single hand, palm out. "Absolute. Silence," I hissed. "The time for talking was when you were plotting to put me in a cage. You wanted the house? You wanted the assets?" I pointed a steady finger toward the front entrance. "You have a choice, David. You can leave through the front door right now with nothing but the clothes on your back. Or—" I gestured to the security guards who were already stepping forward, reaching for their belts. "You can leave in handcuffs for elder abuse, fraud, and embezzlement. I have the police on speed dial, and Mr. Henderson has the evidence." The room went deathly silent. The only sound was the ticking of the Rolex on his wrist, counting down the seconds of his freedom. David looked at the open door. He looked at the handcuffs. He looked at me, and for the first time in his life, he didn't see a mother. He saw the judge, the jury, and the executioner. He took a step back, but just as he turned to flee, the front doorbell rang. A sharp, piercing chime that made him jump out of his skin. "I didn't say the police weren't already here, did I?" I whispered. The heavy oak front door clicked shut with a sound that felt less like a latch closing and more like a guillotine blade finally coming to rest. The silence that followed was not the suffocating, dusty stillness of the tomb I had inhabited for the last 6 months. It was a crisp, sterilized silence. It was the air after a violent thunderstorm, when the ozone hangs heavy and the world feels scrubbed clean. I moved to the window of the drawing room, pushing aside the heavy velvet drapes just an inch. Outside, the drama of expulsion was reaching its pathetic crescendo. David stood on the curb, the gravel of the driveway, gravel he had planned to replace with paved asphalt, crunching beneath his Italian loafers. He looked smaller out there, stripped of the backdrop of my home. He was holding a single cardboard box, the flaps folded awkwardly, containing the few items Henderson had permitted him to take. A framed photo of himself, a stapler, and his collection of silk pocket squares. 2 of the security guards stood at the gate, arms crossed, resembling stone gargoyles come to life. They were immovable, their presence a physical wall between my son and the inheritance he had tried to steal. Then came the final indignity. The tow truck had arrived. It was a loud, mechanical beast, its diesel engine chugging aggressively against the serene backdrop of the estate. The driver, a man in a grease-stained jumpsuit who cared nothing for David's protests, was hooking chains to the axle of the silver Mercedes. David was shouting, his arms waving in erratic, impotent circles. I couldn't hear his words through the double-paned glass, but I knew the script. "This is mine. You can't take this. Do you know who I am?" He didn't understand. The car was leased through the family trust. The insurance was in my name. The gas in the tank was paid for by dividends I controlled. He owned nothing. He was a tenant who had violated the lease, and now he was being evicted. I watched as the Mercedes was hoisted into the air, its gleaming bumper tilting toward the sky like a surrendered flag. The tow truck lurched forward, dragging the symbol of David's unearned status down the long, winding drive. David watched it go, his shoulders slumping. He looked back at the house once. I let the curtain fall back into place. The show was over. I turned away from the window and walked through the hallway. My footsteps on the parquet floor were firm, rhythmic, authoritative. There was no shuffle today. The cane I had used as a prop was leaning in the umbrella stand, collecting dust. I returned to the library. The room was dark, save for the midday sun filtering through the high windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air like microscopic gold coins. I walked to the desk where the leather-bound copy of King Lear still lay, the weapon of his destruction. I picked up the book. The leather was cool and smooth against my skin, worn soft by the hands of generations who understood that legacy is something you build, not something you take. I walked to the shelves, the smell of old paper and vanilla pipe tobacco wrapping around me like a protective shawl. I found the empty slot on the shelf between Hamlet and Macbeth. I slid the book back into place, but I didn't push it, flush with the others. I left it protruding slightly, perhaps half an inch, a jagged tooth in the perfect smile of the library. It was a reminder, a marker. If I ever needed to remember what happens to ungrateful children, the story was right there, ready to be pulled from the shelf. I walked over to the sidebar. The bottle of 1948 Remy Martin still sat there, uncorked where David had left it. The violation of him opening it still stung, but the liquor itself was innocent. I reached for a fresh crystal snifter, the glass cool and heavy in my hand. I poured a generous measure. The amber liquid swirled, catching the light, thick and syrup-like. I carried the glass to my favorite wing-back chair, the one positioned perfectly to overlook the south lawn. I sat down, the leather creaking softly, accepting my weight. Outside the French doors, the garden stretched out in a riot of color. David had called it wasted real estate. He had wanted to scrape it flat, to pour concrete over the earth and erect townhouses that would peel and fade in a decade. But the garden was still here. The hydrangeas were in full bloom, massive heads of indigo and violet nodding in the gentle breeze. They looked heavy, lush, drinking in the sunlight. The oak tree in the center of the lawn, planted by my grandfather, cast a long, protective shadow over the flower beds. It had weathered storms, droughts, and pests, and now it had weathered David. I raised the glass to my lips. The aroma was complex, dried figs, sandalwood, and the sharp bite of alcohol. I took a sip. It burned pleasantly on the way down, a fire that warmed me from the inside out. They mistake kindness for weakness. They see gray hair and assume a fading mind. They see silence and assume ignorance. David thought he could cut me down because he only looked at the surface. He saw the weathered bark, the dry leaves. He forgot to check the soil. The trees in this garden stand the longest not because they are the tallest, but because they have deep roots. They are anchored in history, in patience, in the brutal will to survive when the seasons turn cold. And my roots are still strong. I smiled. It wasn't the polite, wavering smile of a grandmother. It was sharp. It was dangerous. It was the smile of the wolf who had not only escaped the trap, but had eaten the hunter. Secrets have a way of surfacing, don't they? If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to my channel. I have many more locked away in this library, waiting for you.